I'm John Moulis, and welcome to another one of my videos in the series where I talk about workplace bullying, victimisation and harassment in the Australian public service, specifically referring to the Department of Finance in the late 1970s and early to mid 1980s. Now, I got up to where I had to leave the reproduction room in the Department of Finance, in the accounting office. Now, the thing which really opened my eyes was the way in which all of those positions in the reconciliation area had been grossly overclassified. That you had Clerk Class 4 Gary Holmes there earning more than twice what I was earning. And you had Clerk 2-3s there. You had all of these clerks in the office were there, and there were two sections of the office. Sort of my section, which was the reconciliation output, the tapes and microfilm and all that sort of thing. And then there was another section on the other side, which people took phone calls and were doing the reconciliation with the cheques and the and all of the money that had been sent out on the drawing account. But what struck me about that place is that, you know, I was always busy all the time. There was a deadline of 2 o'clock. I had to get the splitting of the microfilm, the splitting of the computer printout sorted, packaged and sent up to registry. I had to take it up to registry in a trolley. I had to do that before 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock was the deadline. So I was rushing my feet off all during the day. And then after 2 o'clock, I had to prepare for the following day's dispatch. You know, it was like a sausage machine. It was, like I said, I mean, I was like some robot, just doing the same thing day in, day out, without variation. Yeah, oh, it was terrible. It was an OH&S nightmare when you think of it now. But I had to do this just non-stop, over and over. And at the same time, these clerks in my area were sitting down doing nothing. You had Gary Holmes, the alcoholic pedophile. He was there, you know, when he hadn't come in with a hangover and had his head on the desk. They're reading the Canberra Times and laughing over Ian Warden's column. You had another guy, Jeff Dane, who was a Tasmanian, came up from Tasmania. He did literally nothing almost the whole day. What happened is that he did 2 bits of work during the whole day. In the morning, there was a little box of computer tapes which came in, because computers back then was on large rolls of tape, 1/2-inch wide tape that the data was stored on. And that box of tape came in. There was a bit of paper with the tapes. You know, there was the tapes for each one of the drawing accounts in each one of the states, I think. And there was a computer printout came in this box. And all he had to do, he had to take out the bit of paper, check the tapes against what was written on the computer printout, and take it down to the computer room. And that was his job. He did that in the morning and in the afternoon, that in the afternoon as well. For the rest of that time, he was sitting down doing nothing, reading newspapers and everything. And it was a popular stereotype at the time about the bludgeoning public servant, sitting down and doing nothing, having no work to do. But it was true for these clerks, these 3rd Division officers. And the tea lady used to come in the morning, I think at 9:30, and in the afternoon at 2 o'clock or 2:30. And I remember one of them used to refer to the dulcet tones of the tea trolley. You know, that was the expression he used, the dulcet tones of the tea trolley. Meaning that was what he looked forward to each day. And of course, tea break, you'd get your cup of tea, you'd get the biscuits off the rack. They were all free. They were paid for by the government. The tea was paid for by the government. you just sat down for half an hour drinking your cup of tea or coffee. I mean, you had boiling water on the tea trolley as well, sitting down, and or else you'd go to the cafeteria and get something from the cafeteria, or a toasted sandwich or whatever, sit down in the morning, have that, and it was a total bludge. And during that period, I was still working. I still had to work, you know, and these clerks were just there, you know, bludging and smoking. I mean, back then you could still smoke inside office blocks, and Albert, the OIC, he was a chain smoker. He used to smoke continuously in the office all the time, and they were just sitting down there bludging and carrying on. I mean, but this guy, this Tasmanian guy, Jeff Dane, he was a real creep. He was the sort of ingrate public service. He apparently worked as a barman at the Rest Point Casino in Hobart, which was the only legal casino in Australia at that stage. And he told us this story. I remember this story he told us. He said that the bank, he received pay packets, and that the banknotes he received in the pay packets were so new that you could rub the ink off them. And of course, at the same time, we were there working in the Treasury building. I mean, we were getting brand new banknotes directly off the press, literally, and they were brand new banknotes. And he was trying to get us to believe that way down there in Tasmania, you know, isolated little Tasmania, thousands of miles away from the action in Australia, that they were getting newer banknotes than what we were getting there in the Treasury building. I mean, it was crap. Total crap. Anyway, you know, all of this was going on, and I was there working my guts out, and I thought it was just totally wrong that I was there getting this acting CA2 wage, which was, I think it was about $160 a fortnight at that stage in 1978, and these bludgers, these clerks, were getting, in one case, 3 times what I was getting paid for doing nothing, for sitting around and doing nothing. Anyway, this business about the bullying and the harassment and the abuse that I was receiving just day after day. I mean, you've got no idea as to how difficult it was to just keep going in there day after day and have to cop this all the time, this. And I still can't understand now how that was allowed to happen. You know, that it just went on for a whole year, me being harassed and victimised and bullied, and no one said anything about it. And other people in the office were noticing it. There was this girl, Angela, I think her name was. She was concerned about it, but nobody said anything about it. And I can well understand why, because that was just considered normal behaviour in the workforce. No one said anything about it. And then when I tried to take it to the director, to tell the director what was happening, he laughed at it, and he said that this is normal behaviour in the public service, that I was the most junior person in the office. I was the youngest person in the office, and that was just my lot. I had to put up with that. I mean, that was the acting director said that to me. He said, you're not at school now, you're not at home with mummy now. And, you know, I went back into the office, and then a few weeks later I was called into the director. You know, the director had come back from leave at that stage, and he called me into the office, and I said the same thing to him, thinking that, you know, it's a different bloke, maybe he'll take it seriously. And I told him what had happened, and you know what he said to me? He said, oh, this should just be water off a duck's back. You know, I'll never forget that. Water off a duck's back. you know, it might be water off a duck's back as a one-off, maybe, but day after day for a whole year having to put up with that, I mean, surely that he would realise that that would have an effect on somebody, just day after day having to come in with these threats of violence, threats of being killed, you know, Roger the Lodger and all of that, punch your lights out, all of this. I mean, Albert was saying the same thing. It was a tag team between Albert, the OIC, and Gary, the alcoholic pedophile. You know, they were like a double act, Tweedledum and Tweedledee, I used to call them. Because, you know, they were always crawling up to each other. They were always... It was a bit like... It reminded me of the TV show MASH, the first couple of series where you had Hawkeye and Trapper. And Trapper was Hawkeye's little sidekick. And they'd be like this double comedy act in the show, bouncing off each other all the time. That was what it was like in that office with Gary and Albert. You know, Tweedledum and Tweedledee. But, oh, you know, by the end of it, I mean, I'd had enough. I told you about January 1979. I was going on leave on the Australia Day weekend, and I was told in advance that I would be moving out of that office. That, you know, I knew that something had to give, because I was coming up to 1 year in that job, acting CA2, and to put somebody in an acting job for a year was unusual to start with, but to you know, and it would be stupid to keep them in that job. I mean, my appointment in the public service was confirmed as a result of a bureaucratic stuff up that the probation report was put in late. I mean, the recommendation went in that my appointment be annulled, but the Public Service Act back then said that if somebody had been in the public service for longer than a year, they were automatically confirmed. So I was automatically confirmed in the public service after a year. I mean, that anniversary came up in November 1978. And anyway, I was told I was leaving that job. I was going back to management services, which was, you know, the services to the people in the department, stationery, printing, photocopying, property, you know, repairing furniture, that sort of thing. And management services was a sort of a lowly sort of area of the department. And anyway, and going back to reconciliation about the bludgers and that sort of thing, Albert, the head of reconciliation, the OIC, he was probably the only one who could possibly have justified his pay, because he was being paid an on-call allowance. He was on call, which meant that at any time of the day, on weekends or you know, 2 o'clock in the morning, 1:30 in the morning, he could be called into work, you know, and that was it. And it was the early days of computers back then. I mean, computers had hardly any power at all. I mean, you know, they were a joke, the computers back then. They took up, one computer took up a whole room in the basement downstairs in the computer room, and they had long rolls of tape that they had to put onto them and all this sort of thing. And they were always breaking down. I mean, Albert, he was nearly always being called in at 1:30 in the morning because the system had crashed. You know, he had to come in, and a couple of times they couldn't get the system running again, and they had to go back to the old manual procedure for doing reconciliation work. And he was there at that, and weekends, Saturday, Sunday, he was being called in and that. So I concede that maybe he justified his salary. But the others underneath him, you know, Gary Holmes, the alcoholic pedophile, Jeff Dane, the rest of it, there was this other guy there, Ian Gerety. I mean, they certainly didn't justify their salary. But anyway, I was told in January 1979 that I was moving back to management services, that I'd be going off for higher duties and I'd be back as a base grader. And the normal procedure was that if somebody had been in the accounting office for a year, they were given a send-off in the office, that you went into ledgers and they had cakes for you, and the director gave you a send-off and everything. And I sort of said, well, sarcastically, I said, oh, I suppose you'll be giving me a send-off because I've been in the office for a year. And Gary Holmes, the alcoholic pedophile, said, no, we're not going to give you a send-off. And I said, well, I've been in here for a year. And he said, oh, no, you actually have to be in the job, doing the job for a year. But, I mean, it was stupid. I mean, I knew they weren't going to give me a send-off, that I hated them and they hated me, and I was probably the reason for the low morale in the office and the stuff-ups and everything that occurred. But, you know, I didn't want a send-off from them, because that job, that was... And what happened, I came back from leave. I went up to Sydney for a couple of weeks, and I came back, started there in management services there, and in office services. And I thought that being free of reconciliation, being free of the accounting office, that I would be able to, that I'd be able to sort of get back into a normal routine. But I couldn't. I mean, for about 3 or 4 months after, I was shell-shocked. I mean, I just couldn't function. I was virtually incapacitated. And I'd be there in the office, and I'd have all of this going around in my head. Roger the lodger, punch your lights out, water off a duck's back. All of that abuse, all of that had happened over that whole year was just going round and round in my head. And I'd be there, and they'd have to virtually wake me up. I was in a daze. And it was most pronounced. I had to go up into the storeroom, the stationary storeroom, and you know, rearrange things, clean it up and that sort of thing. I went in there and I did virtually nothing, because I just had this shell shock, and I realise now what it was. It was post-traumatic stress disorder. It was the same thing that Vietnam veterans and other soldiers experienced after they came back from the war. And I've had that confirmed to me by the mental health service here in Canberra. You know, I told them about all of this, and they identified it as post-traumatic stress disorder. And it was in concert with the disability that I had, the mental disability that I didn't know about at the time that I'd had. You know, I was there. I mean, I actually thought that everybody else was going through this as well, that everybody else was having these problems in life. And that was another thing that they didn't teach you about at school. That was another thing that the careers advisor at school didn't tell you about. You know, how do you cope with this? I mean, how do you cope with bullying and victimisation all the time? How do you cope with post-traumatic stress disorder from incidents which happen in the workplace? There's no manual which says when you start work, they don't give you out a manual telling you how to cope with it. They don't even tell you that was ever going to come up. It just wasn't an issue back then. But I had to deal with it. I had to cope with it. And for most of that year of 1979, I was still trying to get over what had happened to me the previous year of 1978. And like I said, I'm still bitter and resentful about what had happened during that year of 1978. It was terrible. I mean, I'll never get that year back again. It should have been the best year of my life, but as it turned out, it was one of the worst years of my life ever. So, well, anyway, that's about it for this instalment. I mean, I hope you found this enlightening, and I'll come back again with another video about my time at the Department of Finance. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.